It's a hot one out there. I'm driving an earlier JK. I'm not sure what year, but it's probably a 7, 8, or 9. It has an LMG 5.3 Gen 4 engine and a 6L80 transmission. You all know that I like the LMG 5.3 engine. It's iron. It runs on regular gas. Very reliable. Just a great motor in a JK. This JK has basically stock wheels and tires, maybe slightly oversized. No big lift. It's a basic JK. It's not a Rubicon, it's not a Sahara, it's an X or a Sport. It has roll-up windows, no automatic door locks, but it's a good old JK. In fact, it's a lot like the first JK I did a swap on 8 or 9 years ago. It was an 08 X 4-door with a hardtop. This JK is special in a way. Let's go over a few of the features this JK has built into it. First, this JK has our easy engine mounts. There was no cutting, grinding, or welding on the install of this engine. Second, it has our bolt-on aluminum billet bracket. The original AC hoses, power steering hoses, air compressor, alternator, and power steering pump are reused. Third, it has MoCAN. Now, this was a manual transmission JK. Most of you know manual transmission JKs do not display the Prindle. If you look on our dash here, you can see we have Prindle. MoCAN is activating the Prindle on the cluster so that manual transmission JKs can have that readout. If you watch the display, I'm going to kick it back and you can see we're in 5th. We can bump shift, 4th, 3rd, come into a stop here. We can go back into drive. So we have current gear displayed directly on the Prindle. Is that a big deal? Well, to some guys I think it is, but to me it's really not. But to have a Prindle on a manual transmission JK, I think that's pretty cool. What else is controlled by MoCAN? Well, the air conditioning. The air conditioning in this JK is fully controlled through the CAN. There are no wires that connect the GM and Chrysler sides. We're not tapped into either of the computers. To go into a little more detail, we're pulling the AC request out of the Chrysler side, we're putting it into the GM side. We're pulling evap temperature out of the Chrysler side, we're putting it into the GM side so it can control the evap temperature. And right now it's well over 100 degrees out and my outlet temperature is about 50 degrees and it's holding pretty constant. Since the GM side has a valid AC request, it's doing a bunch of things. One, it's controlling the cooling fan. Now this has a JK 2-speed fan. The GM computer is giving the coolant temperature to the cooling fan so that it can cool based on engine coolant temp. It's also controlling it for AC condenser pressure, for transmission fluid temperature. Now I'm going to put my phone here with torque on it so you can see the coolant temp. One of the things about the JK coolant temp gauge is that it hits half gauge at about 185 degrees and it pretty much stays there till about 235 degrees. It's called a customer satisfaction gauge. They know that you want to see that gauge about in the middle while you're driving it, so that's where they keep it. But the reality is there can be up to a 30 degree and more temperature fluctuation and the gauge still stays on the center. I guess the point I'm making on the coolant temp gauge is that you're going to see that fluctuate in small increments. So we're at about 199 degrees right now, and if that temperature were to rise 10 degrees, you're going to see that gauge go up a little bit. We're not going to be stuck on center over a 30 or 40 degree range. In the morning, you're going to see that temp gauge come up and match coolant temp very accurately. The GM side is controlling the cooling fan, the AC compressor clutch based on condenser pressure and evap temperature. It's also controlling engine performance, which means when the AC clutch engages, the GM computer bumps the idle up. AC idle bump it's called. We did a similar thing in our earlier builds using an IAC or idle air control motor, and that was used for many, many years in the 80s and 90s in fuel injected and even carbureted engines, and it worked really well. I still use it today in some builds. Being networked, this air conditioning compressor is being controlled by the GM side. It's being filtered for engine load, engine coolant temperature, meaning it will shut off if the engine temperature gets too high. vehicle speed, fan will react to vehicle speed. So there's a lot of different parameters that are controlling the air conditioning on this, and the GM side is controlling that. It's receiving some of its information, like the interior sensors, from the Chrysler side, but it's actually controlling the system. Essentially what we've done is our MoCAN module is acting as a node in this network, and that node is acting as a gateway for the two sides to communicate. Let's talk about the Prindle. The Prindle on this manual transmission JK is normally not illuminated because it doesn't have to be illuminated. It's a manual transmission vehicle. MoCAN is telling this instrument cluster to illuminate the Prindle. Then MoCAN is getting Prindle or park reverse neutral drive information from the IMS, that's the internal mode switch inside of the 6L80 transmission. It is then sending that signal to the Jeep side so the Jeep side can display the appropriate gear. So we're not only getting park reverse neutral drive, but we're getting current gear. Current gear shows what gear you're in at the time. So if I were to pull back right now, you can see we're in 5th gear, back into drive. We're sitting in a 5.3 liter JK that we finished a week or two ago with our easy install process. This JK does have MoCAN installed, which opened up several features. This JK is a manual transmission JK. However, you can see that there's a Prindle on the dash. The reverse lights, neutral safety, key interlock, brake interlock all work the way they're supposed to. The shifter releases in park just like it's supposed to. No clickety-click. If you have a manual transmission Jeep, even a Pentastar Jeep, the brake interlock will work as it's supposed to. Our Prindle is fully functional. You can see that we have reverse, neutral, drive. If we go back into the manual gate, you can see we're indicating our current gear, which is first. That'll change as you run through these gears. Here's the exciting part, and this is where we're going, and several countries, including our friends down under, require full ESP engagement on key up. Partial off ESP means that active braking is functional, but torque management or traction control is disabled. Now you can disable traction control using this ESP button on the dash. I hope you can see that. And it is selectable, which means once you key up, ESP is fully on unless you have disabled it through the steering wheel dance or a bypass switch. When it's disabled, you'll see ESC off and a dinger come up when you start the vehicle. What we have done with MoCAN is we are bridging modules to get the functionality we want, and one of them is traction control, which means you can have partial off ESP, which is active braking minus traction control, or full ESP engagement, active braking and traction control. Now most of our customers request or prefer traction control to be turned off because the vehicle seems to run better, get better mileage. If you know how to drive traction control, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. However, there are instances where traction control can help you. So with a GM powertrain in a Chrysler vehicle, one of the few features that is not supported, actually I believe it's the only feature that has not been supported, is the full ESP mode. We run in a partial off mode, which is a manufacturer supported mode. So we're moving towards a full ESP engagement mode. And you can see that if I push this ESP button now, we are able to select traction control on and off. This is still in development. It is being incorporated into our MoTech module, and while I realize most of you do not want this feature, some of you require it. Down in Australia, engineering does require it, and it is the main motivating factor for us to get traction control to work. Unfortunately, traction control in these JKs is discrete, which basically means when the ABS module commands power reduction or torque reduction, you get a dead pedal. It just goes to an idle. And that can be dangerous in certain situations, like if you're in the ice and you go into an intersection and you have no throttle, or you're crossing a major highway and you skid and it pulls power back. So adjustable traction control or partial traction control is preferable in my opinion, and yes, we are working on that. What else does MoCAN do? MoCAN is interfacing the air conditioning, the Prindle, cruise control. So if I were to turn the cruise on, you can see the light works. Cruise works exactly the same way it did originally. Actually, it works better with a V8 in my opinion. This build, while a simple JK, is really a demonstration of how simple this swap can be. No cutting, no grinding, no welding. We're running a low-cost but very effective engine, the LMG 5.3. We're running our billet aluminum brackets, which recycle your original accessory drive, power steering pump, AC compressor, and alternator. We're running the original wiring to the alternator. We're running smart charging, if you can see here. That's the engine control module controlling the alternator output based on need. And there's a lot that goes on in smart charging, because basically the system is monitored by the body control module or the TIPM, and then it determines what the most effective charging rate is. That's usually somewhere around 14 to 14.5 volts. If you're going down the highway, it might drop the voltage down. If you're under a heavy load, it'll drop the voltage down. If you're decelerating, it might kick the voltage up. It's also taking into account things like the ABS module and interior modules that are very dependent on system voltage. So we are maintaining that smart charging. The alternator plugs right into the original connector. The air conditioning lines go right back where they were. The power steering lines go right back where they were. So not only is this an economical engine, but you're not spending $1,000 or $2,000 on new accessories like you would be if you were buying a Hemi swap, or even if you were using a GM drive and you had to buy the CTV drive and air compressor and new hoses and all that. So everything about this swap is geared around efficiency and economy, but it doesn't mean it's a cheap swap. I don't like that word cheap. The swap is rationalized. The swap has been well thought out. And by reusing these original components, there's many advantages. Of course, the lower cost is one. Two is parts availability. If you have a GM drive on your JK and you need an air conditioning hose or a power steering hose, you're going down to the hose house, or you're contacting the engine swap manufacturer to get a new one. With our swap, you're going to the dealer, or you just order it right offline and you put it on. Mean that you have factory diagnostics available to you, factory redundancies, factory updates are available to you, as well as emissions compliance. Recently, we've been doing a lot of certification here in Nevada and California, Colorado, to keep it the way GM intended. In fact, this AC compressor right now is cycling, and I can't even feel it. You can't even see it on the tach because the GM side is controlling it so well. This vehicle is going to be delivered to the customer. This customer is going to have it emissions tested here in Nevada. This customer is going to take it to, I believe this is Northern Nevada. I could be wrong. Wherever he's at, he can take this to a dealership. They can plug in and diagnose it if he has a check engine light. The harness is a factory GM harness. It can be replaced by the dealership. All these sensors, coils, calibrations are factory. So everything will be available to him off-site, meaning not in our shop. This is an early JK. This is a pretty simple JK. The only real difference with this one was it is a manual transmission JK, and we got full functionality. We have our brake interlock working, key interlock working, Prindle lights on the shifter, the park neutral safety is working, the Prindle on the dash is working, our current gear is working, tap shift is working. And let me say something about tap shift. We've used various methods to operate tap shift. We can hook it into this cruise control switch. I still prefer the old switch. It's still my favorite. The reality is the MoCAN module has external PID or external inputs so that you can run anything you want. You want to run a paddle, you can run a paddle. You want to run a bump shifter, you can run a bump shifter. I did one build in Australia that we did buttons on the floor of an ice cream truck, and the guy shifted it with his feet. So the MoCAN module doesn't care. All you're going to have to do is get an input into it, and it's going to shift. There's just so many features here, I'm forgetting a lot of them. It's the next morning, we're heading out to the mountain. Let's talk a little bit about the Prindle. The 6L80 is somewhat of a misunderstood transmission. There's a lot of modes that the 6L80 offers that most guys don't understand. This is a truck motor, a 5.3 LMG. It has different modes than, let's say, a LS3 6.2. So the operating system will determine what modes you have, but here's some basic functions. Right now we are cruising along in drive. When you're in drive, you're just an automatic. There's nothing special about it. It'll upshift and downshift And being an adaptive transmission, that means it will learn how you drive and then tailor the shifting accordingly. If we want to downshift, we're going to pull back into manual mode. And what that's going to do is display the current gear. As you can see, we're in 6th right now. So I'm going to come over and tap shift down, and we're in 5th. I'm going to do it again. Now we're in 4th. Now the cool thing about this is I can activate my cruise control right now. It will hold that speed in that gear in cruise control. I'm going to bump shift up one, and then we're going to go back into drive. When you come to a stop and you shift into the manual gate, which is 2nd gear, several things happen. The 6L80 has several modes that are not well understood. Most of you know what drive is. Drive basically means if it's in drive, it'll automatically shift up and down. This is an adaptive transmission, which means it does learn how you drive and then tailors the shifts accordingly. So somebody who drives more aggressively is going to get a more aggressive shift. A person who drives less aggressively will get softer shifts. When you move from the drive gate into 2nd or the manual gate, a lot of different things can happen. If you're moving like I am now, and you were to drop it from drive into 2nd, it would lock you into whatever gear you're in. So that means if you're going up a steep hill and it's hunting between a couple of gears, when it gets into the lower gear, drop it back into the manual gate and it'll lock it into that gear. I call it the gear lock mode. You can then upshift or downshift using the tap shift switch once you're in that mode. Remember, you can always use your cruise control whether you're in drive or in the manual gate. 2, as soon as you touch that manual shift switch and you're in the manual gate, you are in the manual mode. So every shift up, click up on the switch is 1 shift up, every click down is 1 shift down. Of course there are some qualifiers there. If you were to come to a stop, it's not going to stay in the 6th gear. It has to downshift. If you're under a heavy load, you're going up a really steep hill and you're lugging the engine, it will downshift. For the most part, it's going to stay wherever you put it. 3rd mode, and the most misunderstood mode, I'm going to call sport mode. And the sport mode is dependent on the operating system you have. But here's my experience. For the most part, the truck operating systems on the Gen 4s, that would include the 5s, 3s, and the 6.2s. Now we're not including the heavy-duty 6.0 here. Set a maximum gear. So when you come to a stop, you're going to look at your little display here, and it's going to indicate you're in 1st when you put it into the manual gate. Let's say you're going to climb a rock. You're going to run in sand or mud, and you don't want it to shift out of 3rd gear. Well, all you got to do is bump that switch up, and you'll see that parameter change. It'll say 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's still going to launch in 1st, but it's going to set whatever you have selected as the maximum gear. So if you select 3, it will shift 1, 2, 3, and then stop. Of course, you can override that by tapping the switch, and you can shift up or down. If you know you're not going to exceed 2nd or 3rd gear, let's say you're going to go through a canyon, you don't want it to upshift out of 3rd or 4th, just select 4th and go, and it will up and down shift 1st through 4th in a sport mode. And it does seem to shift a little more aggressively. The shifts do seem to be a little bit more delayed, and all that's programmable, of course, but it will not go into 5th or 6th, which are both overdrive gears. In the 6.0 heavy-duty truck programming, here's what I find. You can launch in 2nd gear. So all the other modes are the same, but when you come to a stop, you put it into the manual gate. You will have the option of 1 or 2. You can toggle between 1 and 2. If it's in 1, it'll launch in 1st. If it's in 2, it'll launch in 2nd. 2nd gear launches can be helpful. Again, if you're in sand, let's say, you want to get wheel speed up quickly, and with a torque of a 6-liter V8, you get that really quickly. It's instant torque. You don't have that 1st, 2nd shift. Being able to launch in 2nd can have its advantages. In the old days, when we were running 4 speeds and even 5 speeds, we didn't have as much gear diversity, so the gears were spaced further apart. So when you did make a shift, you would see a pretty wide RPM variation. In these 6 and 8 speeds, you're only seeing a couple of hundred RPM, and when you combine that with RPM rev or match shifting, the shifts are almost imperceivable. So your wheel speed stays constant, you don't lose traction, you don't sink into the mud like you would if you had a 4-speed. And I still have a lot of customers wanting to run and running 4-speed transmissions. There's a lot of disadvantages in my opinion, especially off-road. been doing a lot of yakking. Let me show you some of this stuff. So this is an LMG 5.3, stock radiator, stock cooling fan. Here's our billet aluminum brackets. Not sure how well you can see them, but they're running smooth as can be. This motor was installed with no cutting, welding, or grinding. It was dropped into our easy mounts, and it's extremely smooth. You don't feel any vibrations in the vehicle. And here's what I want to show you. This is our MoCAN module. As you can see, it's potted, it's weather resistant and heat resistant. We can run this in the engine compartment, which we are doing. The reason you see this extension cable on it is because I'm running this next to the exhaust manifold. I'm literally pulling it over to the exhaust manifold so it can get maximum heat. Now, of course, it's not going to be mounted next to the exhaust manifold, but that's what I'm doing to test it. If you look at this MoCAN module, you'll see it is fully sealed and weatherproof, and it also has some auxiliary inputs. And these auxiliary inputs are for things like we discussed, like tap shift. As far as size goes, it's relatively small and compact and very robust. Heat resistant, weather resistant. You can mount it in the engine compartment.